Ukraine's 43rd Mechanized Brigade has its work cut out for it, defending the city of Kupiansk from nearly a year of continuous Russian assaults. But they seem to have found a way to turn the worst terrain in the northern front into an advantage. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about the fighting in Ivanivka and Yadhina. Okay, so Ivanivka and Yadhina are two small towns on opposite sides of the Russian-Ukrainian fault lines. This is located, of course, in the northern front, right near the town of Kupiansk. And you may know that what's interesting about the overall tactical situation is that this river here actually denotes a pretty substantial difference. You can see everything east of Kupiansk is extremely hilly terrain and controlled by Ukraine, but everything west is much flatter. And so, during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Ukrainian forces advanced quite a ways past this river and have largely held these positions since that offensive last year. But Russia has strongly believed that with an appropriate breakthrough, they would be able to sweep the Ukrainian forces aside, because it seems like Ukraine has actually been fairly sparse in its defense of this northern Kharkiv front. So for the 43rd Mechanized Brigade, and this is a Ukrainian unit assembled as part of the big counteroffensive effort, stood up actually in 2023 this year, at least for another 2 days this year, and was equipped, of course, with T-64s, BMP-1s, Brads, and it looks like Soviet self-propelled howitzers. So not a mechanized brigade, but certainly not one of the best, most well-equipped brigades of the war, and one without a tremendously storied history. But certainly, I think this fighting is probably going to end up recorded in the brigade's history going forward. So a lot of fighting has taken place between the 43rd and actually the Russian 26th Tank Regiment, right? Which by all accounts should mean that the fighting is mechanized. And for the Russian forces in Yadhina, right, their goal here, the 26th, is to obviously take the town of Ivanivka, push into Stepova, Novoselivka, and then ultimately their goal, I think, is to be able to advance along this roadway here and eventually lay siege to the town of Kupiansk, which would represent probably the Russians' best bet to cross this Oskil River that forms kind of demarcates the natural barrier between the hilly defensive western side of Kharkiv and the flatter, more open terrain of eastern Kharkiv. So holding Ivanivka is seen as pretty essential for the 43rd's efforts. Now, from what I've seen, this is kind of where things get interesting. Let's take a look at let's first take a look at the terrain map. And the reason I kind of like these satellite images is that it gives us a really good idea of what exactly oh my God, I can't get rid of all this. Of what exactly the Russian forces are, the tactical problem that they need to solve, right? So zooming in, and this is some good data. Can we get a street view? No, that would have been cool. But notice how this is actually pretty straightforward. This actually, look closely. You can actually see, this was taken in 2022, but you could see actually the artillery pockmarks throughout the fields here, which I find kind of interesting. But notice that basically Yadhina is a town with robust cover and concealment, right? Lots of wood lines, lots of houses that appear, at least in this satellite image, relatively intact. In contrast, Ivanivka, basically the same thing. Sparser houses, but more woodland. And of course, there is essentially one main roadway that passes between the two. And this roadway, of course, has a small windbreak separating two farmers' fields. There's also, of course, a dirt path separating these farmers' fields to the north, and a similar sparse path to the south that's somewhat less accessible. But you can basically see that if Russian forces' goal is to get from Yadhina to Ivanivka, they've got one road they can do it in. And this is the core problem that they have to solve. The problem for Ukrainian forces is what you can see here in this topo map, right? Now you can see here's Yadhina, and here's Ivanivka, and here's Yadhina. Notice the problem. Ivanivka is in low ground, very low ground, in fact, and Yadhina is actually in much higher elevation. Again, is it a ton? No, the red is about 185 meters and the green is about 143 meters. So you're talking about 40 meters of difference. Not a ton, but 40 meters is a lot. And so normally when you are occupying a defensive position, you want to seek out the most elevated positions possible. And undoubtedly, the 43rd has occupied these tree lines here and holds some of these elevated positions, no doubt about it. But by most accounts from what I've seen, they also are staging a lot of equipment here inside Ivanivka. And the reason, I think, is that they are essentially turning the entire town into one giant trench. Why do I say this? Well, I've taken a look at a lot of the combat footage from these regions, and it seems like the 43rd has kind of a pretty polished tactic in response to the Russian assaults. But before I break that down, I wanted to real quick mention it's New Year's, and if you guys are like me, you have a lot of resolutions, and of course, I have a lot of diet and fitness resolutions that require me to maintain a high level of focus, but because I don't want the sugar of an energy drink, I needed an alternative. Anyway, this is part of the reason I developed Strike Gum. Strike Gum is made right here in the USA at a facility in Denver, and each individual piece contains 100 milligrams of caffeine, as much as an energy drink, but no sugar and just 15 calories in each piece. Plus, it has 100 milligrams of alpha GPC, and 50% of the proceeds from this first production run are going to benefit Ukrainian civilians who've been injured or displaced in the conflict. So check us out, strikegum.com. We actually have a New Year's sale with free shipping on orders over $70 in the US and orders over 100 internationally. So if you've been waiting to order or reorder, now is definitely the time. Check us out, strikegum.com. Okay, so I've looked at a lot of the footage of the fighting here in these two regions, or these two towns. And essentially, what the 43rd seems to have done is that they know that the 25th has not a lot of options in front of them, right? There are 3 roads they can cross to get to the opposing town. And primarily, it's this central roadway here. So what Ukraine has done, and the 43rd has done, is they've mined all of these fields, right? Every one of these fields between Russian forces have been absolutely scattered with mines, meaning that Russian light infantry and Russian armored vehicles cannot pass through them, restricting them to one of 3 possible routes. The other problem is that the 43rd is basically flying drones, as far as I can tell, nonstop. They have this Yadhina under continual observation. And that means that they can see well ahead of time when Russia is preparing one of its assault groups, which at this point seem to involve maybe 3 to 5 armored vehicles, BMPs or T-64s or T-72s, right? And about 50 infantry. So small assault elements. And when one of these assault elements begins to roll, right, as they transition into this open terrain, one of the things that happens is that Ukrainian artillery will usually open up. They'll usually have pre-sighted positions along some of these key intersections. They'll drop in artillery rounds trying to take out the lead vehicle. And sometimes we also see drones, but generally it seems like drones will only go after the vehicles once they've been immobilized. So artillery, possibly, I think sometimes they seem to use anti-armor teams, but again, because Ivanivka's in this low ground, right, their artillery is actually in some ways protected. Because imagine you're a tanker. You roll out across this flat terrain, but what you can't see is everything below it, right? So this entire Ukrainian formation here is hidden below eye level. The only way they can see it is if they were to fly drones. And again, even if they could fly drones, the ability of a tanker to put fire into this town is limited. Because again, imagine you're a tanker. You can't shoot at something you can't see. Artillery can, right? With grid coordinates and it can deliver that level of precision. But a tank, a BMP, those gunners can't do that. So even Ivka's forces, right, their armor teams can stay hunkered down in this low ground. And they can attempt, what they're doing is using artillery, mortars, or even sometimes scatterable mines to take out the lead vehicle. They will disable the lead vehicle somewhere along this road, and then once that lead vehicle is disabled, the other vehicles in the convoy come to a halt. And then the drones start to come out and will often take out the second or third or one of the trailing vehicles, locking the convoy into place. Once they're locked into place, often at times it seems like the Russian forces will simply either veer into, in a panic, into the mined areas to the north and south, these mined fields, and will destroy their own vehicles. Or occasionally it seems like Russian forces will actually dismount and run into trenches along this thin strip here. But as you guys can probably tell, if artillery already has this road sighted, once those Russian infantry climb into these trenches, they're in a fixed position. They're stuck in place. And remember, the artillery is sitting safe and secured, surrounded on all sides by a wall of dirt. So this artillery can fairly leisurely pick these forces apart. And on the off chance, right, that some number of infantry or or mechanized forces actually make it to, again, it looks like this windbreak right here is where the low ground starts to transition. And you can see literally that is the exact line where they're reporting Russian forces control. And the reason is because imagine you're a tanker, right? You're rolling along level terrain, and then eventually you get to the point where you start to tilt down and you look at the enemy. Well, here's the problem. You are seeing the enemy for the first time. You have direct fire access to them. They can now see you as you come over the top, right? And imagine you're sitting on the bottom. You're an anti-armor crew. You're looking up at a hilltop. You're watching the enemy slide down the hill. It's actually a really easy shot. And because the tanks are tilted ever so slightly going down the hill, the Ukrainian forces actually are able to engage them from the top. And similar to infantry, right? Imagine you crest a hill and you look down. It's called a slope defense. And you're sitting here, right? You're sitting right here and you're looking at the enemy as they advance down this hill. It's actually really easy. It's a really effective tactic. And it's fascinating that, again, you can see on this map right here, this windbreak is exactly where the terrain changes from its highest elevation and begins to slope downward. And that's exactly where the Russian forces have been unable to penetrate. And as you can see here, right, it's been days and days and days where this hasn't happened. You can see, right, even yesterday, Russian forces doing some preparatory artillery strikes, but we see probably a couple times a week, Russian forces are launching these assaults. And the fact is that for days and days and days and days, Russian forces are unable to budge. You can see the most recent changes are actually that it looks like Russian forces are starting to pull out of some of these areas to the north, right, because they've just been unable to crack into Ukrainian defenses. So this is, again, a testament to the 43rd's commanders who have really, really taken the time to understand both the enemy's tactics and how to effectively counter them. One other thing I want to point out is, of course, that drones are often being used here on kind of cleanup crew duty. So oftentimes, if the Russian attack gets repelled, those drones will chase the Russian forces all the way until they return to Yahidna to regroup and try again later. And again, really worth pointing out, Russian forces have really had a hard time seizing Ivanivka for any meaningful length of time, no matter how much they push. Because again, they're stuck, they're canalized. Anyway, that's all I had, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Of course, thanks to all the members of combatvetnews.com. Next week, we're going to take a look over on Combat Vet News, some uncensored footage from this battle. I can't show you combat footage here on YouTube, so I do it on combatvetnews.com. Thanks to all our members. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.